That's great. Thank you very much for that. Can you hear me okay? And can everybody else hear okay? Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I'm seeing some nods. Perfect. So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along today to talk to you about cycling for everyone. If the pace isn't right for the translation, please let me know and I will alter it. But I've got some slides to go through to talk about some work that we did that was a guide for inclusive cycling in towns and cities called Cycling for Everyone. So if we move to the next slide, please. The report was done through some internal ARUP funding, internal research funding, and we also did the work with Sustrans, which is a UK charity aimed at making it easier for people to walk and cycle. And Sustrans also looks after the National Cycle Network in the UK, which is a UK-wide network of signed paths and routes for walking, cycling, wheeling, and exploring outdoors. And this is the report, and there'll be a link to it later on in the slides. So if we go to the next slide, why was it important for us to do this? I think, you know, it is fundamental that cycling has to be for everybody, and there's a whole range of benefits. There are socioeconomic benefits in making sure that cycling is accessible to everybody. There are very strong health benefits that come from cycling, both in terms of physical activity, but we also know in terms of mental health and mental well-being. And then there are the environmental benefits in terms of improving air quality, transport decarbonisation, and helping with the climate crisis. So it's really important that as many people as possible are encouraged to cycle. If we look at the next slide and the project aims, what we wanted to do was to really understand the barriers that stop people cycling at the moment. And those barriers could be physical, but they might not be. And then once we understand the barriers, then we can look at developing solutions to make cycling better for everybody. So the intention was to develop guidance to help make cities and towns better for everybody to cycle in, and to encourage dialogue across organisations. And it was really important to hear it from people themselves. We didn't want us guessing what the barriers were or guessing what reasons were that people don't cycle. It was very important that through that process, we heard direct from people themselves. So what we did on the next slide is, first of all, we undertook a literature review to see what was out there at the moment in terms of why people don't cycle, who cycles at the moment and who doesn't. Then Sustrans has a survey every other year called Bike Life, which gives lots of data. So we looked at the existing data that was available through Bike Life. Most of that is from people who already cycle, and we were really keen to hear from the people who don't cycle. So we then had 13 focus groups across the UK, and they were focused on different types of people and their needs. So, for example, to do with older people, to do with people who have disabilities, women, people from deprived areas, etc., to really find out more from those people, both those who cycle and those who don't, to see what their feelings were. We also did case study research to see what was happening around the world in terms of encouraging more inclusive cycling. And then we had 3 stakeholder workshops in different parts of the UK that were really to feed back what we'd heard about the barriers, the reasons people don't cycle, but also to get views on what could be done to make it better, to encourage more people to cycle. And then the report was published just over 2 years ago in July 2020. So it was quite a long process, but I said we really wanted to hear from people directly. We didn't want to second guess why people were cycling or not cycling. And the next slide shows sort of the adult groups who cycle less. This was because the Bike Life data was surveys of adults, not children. And the 5 key groups that you can see there who are groups that cycle less: women of all ages, older people, by which we were looking at people aged 65 and over, people who identified as having a disability, including those with a long-term health condition, people from ethnic minorities, and also people who suffer from deprivation, so in lower socioeconomic groups, or people living in areas of multiple deprivation or lower income households. And what we found is, not surprisingly, there are lots of overlaps between these groups. So there's this large intersectionality. So, you know, some people were women, older, and disabled, perhaps from an ethnic minority, and living in a area of multiple deprivation. So some people might have been across all 5 of those groups. Some people were just one of them. But I said there were lots of overlapping barriers. Alex, you've got your hand up. Do you want me to? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, Susan. Yes, I just want to give a quick message in Spanish because some new people have arrived. So just give me 5 seconds. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, of course.
Pero para las personas que llegaron recién. No, en español está bien para el traductor. Para las personas que ya acaban de llegar, pueden espichar un icono que hay abajo a la derecha que dice traducción simultánea o algo así. Entonces ponen el idioma en que quieren escuchar. Vale, gracias. Adelante, Susan, por favor. So continue, Susan, please. Thanks.
Thank you for that, and welcome to anyone who has joined. I was just going through some of the background to this research, and I said the current slide really looking at the groups of people who don't cycle so much at the moment, which was to do with the focus of the study, why they don't cycle at the moment, and critically what could be done to encourage them to cycle. So if we look on the next slide, what we found is that although a lot of people don't cycle, there's a lot of demand for it. So if you look at the top line on ethnic minority groups, you can see that sort of 16% of people don't associate cycling as being something for them. And they don't cycle, but they would like to start. So 55% of people in ethnic minority groups don't currently cycle, but would like to start. For people in lower socioeconomic groups at risk of deprivation, again, 38% don't cycle, but would like to. For women, 36% don't, but would like to. So there was a lot of interest in cycling for various reasons. So it isn't that the people who are not cycling, just don't want to. They want to, but there's something stopping them. And that's what we wanted to find out more about in this piece of work. So on the next slide, we have sort of some of the barriers that people talked about in terms of safety. I'm sure that's a very common one globally. If people don't feel safe cycling, they might have confidence in their ability. Maybe they cycled as a child and haven't cycled since, or didn't learn as a child. They may think cycling is not for them if they have a disability, for example, and they don't see other disabled people cycling. They might not realize that there are cycles that would actually work for them. It may be financial. If you don't have a cycle to start off with, it's not so easy to get out there and start riding your bike if you've got to actually invest in getting hold of a bike in the first place. For some people, it's where would they park a cycle? Particularly people living in flats or places where they haven't got any outside space, where can they leave their bike? And others, it's to do with increased visibility and feeling other ways of sort of feeling vulnerable in terms of attracting too much attention if they cycle, and fears around sort of personal safety and harassment. And we picked up some interesting quotes. There's the quote that's shown in the box there to say, "I'm frightened to cycle as my reactions aren't as quick. I can't pedal as quick, and therefore I can't react and get out of problems or avoid difficulties." And I think for many people, they see cycling as something sporty that fit people do. They see it as something quite fast, and it's quite an intimidating environment, not just from cars or trucks, but actually for other cyclists if people feel that they don't fit in. So what we found on the next slide is that sort of most of those barriers are shared between the 5 groups that I mentioned earlier. And therefore, our research focused on the solutions that would benefit the most groups or multiple groups. And so we really looked at the barriers and the recommendations in terms of 3 key themes, which are shown there. The first one is about the importance of improving governance and improving planning and decision making. The second one is about welcoming and supporting all people to cycle. And people maybe think that happens already, but some of the research was that we don't. And then the third one, which is probably the more obvious one, is to do with creating better places for everybody to cycle in. So we looked at it in terms of those 3 groups, and I'll just talk in a bit more detail about those. So the first barrier, which is to do with governance, it's really making sure that we are representative in decision making. There's a real risk that people plan and design in their own image, and therefore if decision making is not representative from across all groups, it doesn't take into account all groups. There can also be a problem if engagement with the public is not representative. Again, we find in consultations and surveys, typically it's certain groups or certain demographics that respond to that, and other people are often excluded, or they think it's not relevant to them, or they think they haven't got anything to offer. So, we find quite often that engagement with the public is not representative of the total population. Transport policy often ignores beneficiary need. It's looking at transport in terms of which areas have the greatest need, where is the highest levels of social inequity, not just responding to the people who are shouting loudest for something, who might not be actually in the most need. It's to do with having the right standards to make sure that the cycling is inclusive. It isn't just designed around a high-speed, 2-wheeled, racing bike. Actually, we need to think about the different types of cycles we see today. And, we see cycles that are tricycles or that have trailers or forms of cargo cycles, and they have different infrastructure requirements. And also we need to make sure that there's representation in marketing. So, when we have imagery, it is imagery that is aimed at all people. We don't have, as is shown in the photograph there at the bottom, a panel of men deciding about transport for everybody. So we need to make sure that when we have decision makers and have discussions, the people who are doing that are inclusive of the general population. If we look at the next barriers, which is to do with places, probably the most common concern is road safety concerns and fears over safety. But I said we do have cycling infrastructure which is not inclusive, where you have either the surfacing is not right, or there are barriers that are put up perhaps to stop motorbikes, but then they can end up stopping some people with some types of some form of cycles as well. This often we can have the situation where cycling infrastructure does not reach all areas or cater for all journeys. Again, if it's lobbied for by a certain group in the population, then it may be for a particular type of leisure journey, for example, for people who want to do, leisure cycling at the weekend. But actually, it's really important to make sure that cycling is suitable for all journeys, for shorter journeys, for everyday journeys, because those are the ones that are being undertaken by a lot of people who do not cycle at the moment. It's also about having public cycle share provision, including electric and adapted cycles. So where you have cycle hire schemes, for example, they're a really good way to encourage new cyclists to get out there and give it a go. You don't have to invest in buying a bike and buying other things or worry about where to store it. It's a way to actually try out cycling and see how you get on. But I said that needs to be for a whole range of cycles, so ideally including electric cycles, and we're starting to see more in terms of electric cycle hire schemes, and also ideally adapted cycles, so people can try that out. Barriers about personal safety and security. People don't feel safe, they feel marginalized, they feel they'll be called names. There's all of those issues will stop somebody from cycling if they are subject to harassment, or if they fear harassment. And then the last one in terms of places is integrating cycling with people's homes, with the places that they're cycling to, and with public transport. So that's about things like having good, safe, secure cycle parking, particularly in people's homes, I said, where you've got blocks of flats, but also at the workplace or shopping, where people feel that they can leave their cycles and leave their cycles safely. And then the last in the barriers is to do with people. And I said a lot of that is that people don't associate cycling as something for people like them. If people don't see themselves in the images of cycling, they'll think that cycling is something for other people. It is not for people like them. I said also issues around the accessibility and ownership of a bike, or ownership of a cycle rather. It's to do with cycling ability and or confidence. If people, I said, don't feel confident riding a cycle because it's a long time since they've done it as a child. And I said, again, it is this fear of harassment that will stop some people from cycling. So those were the three areas of barriers that we looked at. And what I want to focus on now is the recommendations that we made in the report to try and help overcome those barriers. And it follows the same pattern. They're in three groups. One is to do with governance and planning, one is to do with places, and one is to do with supporting all people. And there's more information on all of these, including case studies in the report, which is a document of some 70 to 80 pages. But if we take the first one, which is improving governance, planning, and decision-making, recommendations in three main areas for these. The first one is having walking and cycling strategies that really look at how they reduce inequity. So that should be a key part of the strategy is how does it actually help to reduce inequity. Then it's about increasing diversity and representation in decision-making and also in the transport sector, and then improving decision-making through better evidence and public engagement. And I've got a slide on each of those. So if we go to the first one, which is about designing strategies and plans to really address and then to be evaluated against how they reduce inequity. What we found is that many cycling strategies they lack objectives and plans that align these aims to people who need to benefit the most. So it's really, I said, not responding to where the greatest calls are for cycling, but actually to look at areas which have poor transport options, to look at areas where there is no cycling at the moment, to say, well, maybe that's an area we should be targeting for improving infrastructure. And so the actions are about designing cycling strategies and plans to be inclusive, to help reduce social inequity. For example, having an equity framework to see what the impact of that plan might be. And a big part of this is increasing particularly long-term funding for cycling. It can't be done on a year-by-year basis. And the case study example there is of Oakland in California. And the city there had an equity framework that was used to measure inequities and then to track changes for different groups of people over time. And I said this framework can be used to guide and inform policies that address these disparities, such as the Oakland bike plan. So that's a way of doing it a bit differently. The second one, in terms of the governance, planning and decision making, is all about increasing diversity and representation in decision making and in the transport sector. And this is, the example there is given for the UK, where members of parliament, assemblies and councils, along with the senior civil servants, transport planners, they're typically not representative of the wider population. And this can lead to both conscious and unconscious bias. We design for the journeys that we make. We design for people who look like us. We don't understand what it's like for other people in terms of how they might cycle. And an example there for the UK Parliament 2019 figures, the fact that only 34% of MPs were female, most of the MPs are white, very few disabled MPs. So these are the people making decisions. And I said that they're possibly, they're not fully representative of the whole population. So the actions suggested are to invest and to increase diversity in the transport sector, which is itself is largely male. Typically, I think it's fairly globally, the transport sector is about 80% male. And also then to increase representation in decision making and commissioning to make sure all those voices get heard. And then the third one in this category on the next slide of increasing governance, planning and decision making is about having better evidence and better public engagement. And actually, for most of the time, the data we have on who cycles and critically who doesn't cycle is really poor. Where there are cycle counters, and you can get the automatic cycle counters sometimes, all they do is count numbers that are cycling probably into and out of a city centre. They don't look at other journeys, more local journeys, and we don't know anything about who is cycling. You know, is that just one demographic cycling? So they give very little information. And of course, critically, they don't tell us who is not cycling, which are the sort of people we want to get out there. And also it's the people who already cycle who typically respond to consultations on cycling. If I don't cycle at the moment, I'm not going to respond to a consultation that says cycling because I think that's not for me. So the actions there are about improving consultation to be more representative. So maybe rather than saying cycling consultation, make it about transport in general, or make it about improving air quality, or other issues such as combating climate change. So make it more to do with the outcomes that can be achieved by cycling, rather than actually labeling it something to do with cycling. There can be other engagement techniques for better representation, and the image there is of the climate assembly that was held in the UK, a way to try and engage more people in the discussion, and also improve the evidence base for policy to have more data to make better decisions. So those are the governance ones. If we go to the next lot of recommendations now, which are about creating better places for everyone to walk and cycle in. And this is about things such as improving road safety through protected space, addressing personal safety and harassment, and making sure that cycling infrastructure is fully inclusive. And again, a slide on each of these. So the first one is about creating, if you can move on the next slide, please, sorry, creating better places for everyone to cycle. And that's about improving road safety, primarily through protected space for cycling and low traffic neighbourhoods. And we know certainly in the UK, sorry, could you move the slide on to the next one, please? Perfect, thank you. We know that in the UK, the main reason that people don't cycle is because they think it's dangerous. And whether it is or whether they just think it is, that's going to be enough to stop people cycling. So the survey I talked about earlier, the Bike Life survey, which is of 16,000 people, that found that only 38% of residents feel their city is a good place to cycle. And about 3/4 of urban residents think safety for cycling needs to be improved. So real concerns around safety. So the actions there are about providing protected space as part of a cohesive cycling network. It's not enough just to have a white painted line. It needs to be properly protected for people to feel safe. Implementing low traffic neighborhoods, which are all about trying to get traffic which is taking shortcuts through residential streets away from those residential streets. We've seen a big increase in traffic on residential streets over the last 10 years, with people being guided by their smartphones all the time to take back routes. So we see traffic going on inappropriate routes. So the idea to have low traffic neighborhoods to take out that traffic, and also other measures to make cycling safer. For example, having lower speed limits, 20 mile an hour or 30 km/h speed limits, just to reduce the speed of traffic to make it safer for cycling. If we look at the next slide, that's about addressing personal safety and harassment. And we know that there's been increased harassment in the UK in relation to people's ethnicity, in relation to their gender, and in relation to their disability. And so the numbers there, the percentage of people from risk of deprivation, older people and disabled people, for them, reducing antisocial behaviour or crime is very important for improving cycling safety. So the actions there are to improve route planning and critically to ensure a choice of route is available, because sometimes what is seen as a safe route during daytime might not be seen as a safe route during hours of darkness. To improve the design of infrastructure and places so that people feel safe. And that can be helped by things such as the safety pin idea, the image shown on the right there. And this originated in India, and it's a mapping tool where people who feel unsafe can highlight it on a map. And the more people that do that, you start to see a picture emerge of where people don't feel safe. And so those areas can be focused on for actually improving safety. But it's also really important, obviously, to eradicate harassment, including institutionalized harassment and racism. That's an important part of it, which is part of education, part of enforcement to do with the police as well. And then the next one, in terms of creating better places for everyone to cycle, is to make sure that cycling is fully inclusive. So in the UK, we have an Equality Act, which places a duty upon the public sector to protect people from discrimination in wider society. And the quote there is from the lady in the wheelchair. She's a hand cyclist. And she says that having built and catered for one main profile of cyclists for too long, the middle-aged male, we have baked in long-standing barriers to cycling for disabled people. It is time this changed. That's a woman called Isabel Clement, who runs an organisation called Wheels for Wellbeing. And I said a lot of the time it's about having barriers that you can get through with a normal bike, but you couldn't, for example, get through with a hand cycle. So the actions there include removing barriers on existing cycle infrastructure that have been put in over the years. I said maybe to stop motorbikes or mopeds, to make sure that inclusive design standards are set and that they are followed, and to make sure and really embed inclusive design and engineering practice so it becomes second nature. And if we look at the next one, in terms of better places, it's really important to better integrate cycling at people's homes, at their destinations, and with public transport. And we know that people on low incomes are more likely to live in smaller homes, to live in flats, to live in high-rise properties where it's far harder to store a cycle. And also we know that people on low incomes are more likely to live in areas of higher crime and also to fear crime. So it's very important to improve secure cycle storage at people's homes, prioritising flats and multiple occupancy buildings. And that can be through the type of cycle storage you can see in the photograph there. You can get cycle hangars or cycle sheds where multiple cycles can be stored. It's also about improving cycling facilities at the destinations people are cycling to, whether that's to do with their workplace, whether it's where they're going shopping, hospitals. People need that secure cycle facility. And also to improve integration with public transport, whether that's through bus or through train, so people can actually cycle from home to the station or to the bus stop, and look at it in terms of a total journey. And then the last one there about creating better places for everyone to cycle is to look and really prioritise infrastructure where transport options are poor, especially where this coincides with multiple deprivation. So we know again from the Bike Life data that 51% of people from ethnic minority groups would find cycle routes to shops, to schools, and local destinations helpful to cycle more, those everyday journeys. And also a third of older people, 44% of disabled people, would find cycle routes to green spaces and the local countryside helpful to cycle more. Again, the importance there as well of some leisure cycling. And the actions are to do with prioritising cycle routes upon need, as well as the number of potential people cycling, because otherwise it tends to focus on the commute and the journey to work, and all routes lead to the city centre, whereas a lot of the journeys that people want to make are not right to the city centre, they're around the city. And also to improve the reach and inclusivity of public cycle share schemes, again, beyond the city centre, as transport planners for years, we tend to focus on the journey to work because that's the journey that we make. So we focus on our own journeys and we neglect these other local journeys. And then if we move on to the third category, which is on the next slide, which is giving sort of support and welcome for all people to walk and cycle. And the recommendations here are in three main areas. The one is using inclusive language and imagery, ensuring that walking and cycling is welcoming and actually celebrates diversity, ensuring that cost is not a barrier to having a cycle, and then offering free cycle training for all children and adults. Quite often it focuses on children, but it's important for adults too. And I've put it on the same image just as a reminder of the bit on the right hand side of all the people who do not cycle but would like to start. If only we could make cycling something for them and they felt included in doing so. So on the next slide, welcoming and supporting all people to cycle, about using inclusive language and imagery and ensuring cycling is welcoming and celebrates diversity. And I probably should have put a big cross over this image because I'm not showing it as an example of good things. If you Google cycle in the UK or cyclist in the UK, that's the sort of image that you get. You know, cycling is something, I said, if you're fit and sporty, and it's making sure we don't use images like that. So please don't think of that as a good image. And also we know that cycling often has strong associations with identity. It can be a bit of a club. You know, people always describe themselves as a keen cyclist sort of thing. And that means that other people feel excluded. So it's about a use of inclusive language. And I always try and use the word cycle rather than bicycle, because a bicycle is a two-wheeled, more conventional. Cycle can include tricycles or different types of cargo cycles or cycles with trailers or adapted cycles. So it's sometimes it's as important as quite small things in language. And it's about welcoming all people who, I said, who want to cycle and to really celebrate the diversity of cycling in all its shapes and forms. Then the next recommendation on the next slide is about ensuring that cost is not a barrier to access a cycle. We know that the initial cost of cycling is high, particularly if you need an adapted cycle. Cycles range hugely in terms of their cost, but if you need an adapted cycle, a specialist cycle, then it can become very expensive. Government funding in the UK has focused on the Cycle to Work scheme. Again, we focus on these work journeys, but that excludes people who are not in employment and those on lower incomes. So we need to make funding better available for people who don't have access to a cycle at the moment. And research from the survey found that sort of 1 in 5 people from ethnic minority groups and people more likely to be at risk of deprivation state that the cost of a suitable cycle is a barrier for not cycling. So it's about having those higher schemes. If people have got cycles that they don't use, maybe they could be repurposed for other people. There are different ways of doing that. So the actions are about ensuring that cost is not a barrier for anyone to purchase a cycle and to also improve the purchasing experience. Certainly in the UK, bike shops can be quite intimidating places to go into. They can, if you don't already cycle, it can be an awkward experience to go into a cycle shop and you feel that you don't know the right questions to ask. You haven't got the right language. You're maybe not seen as a cyclist and you think people won't take you seriously. So it's all about improving the purchasing experience as well. And then the last of these recommendations in terms of welcoming and supporting all people to cycle is to do about cycle training and the importance of offering free cycle training for all children and for all adults. So we know that many people have never learned to cycle or do not feel confident in their cities or in their town roads. So it's about having free cycle training, I said, for everybody to build confidence and to make cycling fun. And the quote there, we know that cycling take-up in the UK is unequal and many miss out on the benefits and children are disproportionately excluded. So only 3% of adult commuters cycle to work in England and fewer than 2% of children cycle to school. So there's a lot more that can be done to improve confidence and to help make it fun. So that's the details of the Cycling for Everyone report. I wanted to just briefly mention that we've also done a report called Walking for Everyone, which follows the same sort of pattern in terms of what are the barriers, why do certain people not walk, what can be done to improve. And I've put the link in for the Walking for Everyone report there as well. And I said that's really about making sure that everyone has a genuine choice to walk and that people feel comfortable and welcome while they're doing so. And again, this focus on reducing wider social inequity. So how can we better prioritize marginalized groups when improving walking to help reduce that inequity? So that report came out earlier this year if people are interested in having a look at that. On the slide here, I've got my contact details and a link to the Cycling for Everybody report. And then I think that's onto my final slide. And then I think there are some Kahoot questions, I think is how it's working out. So if we go to so that's my thank you and me prioritizing walking and cycling. And then I think it will be handing back to Alex or to Edna for the questions, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Susan. I really appreciate that perspective. I think we have had exchanges of, in different sessions with the public officials who are working in these municipalities, and always it comes out that the fact that there's a lack of public policy, and I think what you just showed, I would say it's a basis to start informing at least that desire of really crafting perhaps a public policy that would aim and would strive for promoting cycling, as you say, not just bicycles, but cycling for people with, from different groups, with different capacities. And I think that overcoming that barrier of really making people feel that, it's not other people who really can bike or cycling, but it's that every person with its different capacities could also be part of that group of cyclists. So thanks a lot. We will open up for questions, Edna.
Thanks, Susan, for your time and for sharing this information. Ahora queremos saber si de pronto el público tiene alguna pregunta muy puntual para hacerle a Susan, o si no, ella también nos tenía dos preguntitas que las voy a compartir ahora en pantalla. Sí.
Perdón, I think, bueno, creo que tienes que pasar, Susan, you have to put your channeling in the translation, y la persona que ayuda con la traducción, creo que hay que hacer las preguntas en español, claramente.
Sí, ella ya lo tenía en el canal de español, entonces esperamos que nos confirme si nos está escuchando, Susan.
Yes, I am. Yes, yeah, I can hear you in English. Yeah, I can't see the questions in English, so maybe there's a translation thing for the comments, but I can hear the questions fine in English.
Okay, perfect. Bueno, no sé si las personas del público quieran hacerle alguna pregunta muy específica a Susan sobre algunos aspectos que ella nos ha mostrado o algunas preguntas que les surjan a ustedes con base en las experiencias que también han tenido en cada uno de los municipios. Pueden hacerlas tranquilamente en español, que el traductor nos hace el favor para que Susan nos responda. O tal vez en el chat, si aparece que sí se han animado.
Edna, Diego Fernando tiene una primera pregunta. Dice, ¿qué experiencia tienen con ciclistas urbanos? Aquellos que usan la bicicleta por cuestiones de traslado al trabajo desde su hogar o que realmente la usan para el trabajo y en su mayoría no llevan las normas como reflectivos, no usan los implementos que deberían utilizar como reflectivos, cascos y luces. ¿Cómo se podría trabajar con esos retos o con ese tipo de personas que viajan al trabajo, ¿cierto?, en un uso diario, pero que no tienen los implementos necesarios?
Yeah, we do see elements of that, but it is very much a minority of people. So helmets aren't compulsory to wear in the UK. We do see some cyclists who don't obey the red traffic lights, who should do, and there is some police enforcement to help with that. But I think it is very much a minority of cyclists. The vast majority of cyclists do, certainly in the UK, do pay attention to the regulations, largely for their own safety as much as anything else. So I think it's, some of it is to do with education, some of it is to do with enforcement when people don't obey the rules. Other times it can be peer pressure. You know, if everybody else is waiting at the lights and one cyclist doesn't, then sometimes you actually hear the cyclists who are waiting shout at the cyclist who isn't, because it is those minority of cyclists that get everybody else a bad name. So there can be some peer group pressure. So there are some issues, but generally they're in the minority. And actually, I think the more inclusive cycling becomes, the more we get new people cycling, they tend to obey by the law. And I think that helps to, helps with the behavior of everybody. I think, in places where cycling is very much dominated by the single demographic of the male fast cyclist, that's when it becomes very competitive and often people don't keep to the rules. But when you have a broader selection of people cycling, that tends to improve everybody's cycle behavior, because they see children cycling and older people cycling, and then it doesn't become such a race. It's actually people helping each other out.
Okay. Tenemos una pregunta de Rubén Darío. Él trabaja en el municipio de Jumbo y nos preguntan si considera que es necesario incluir desde el colegio, como parte de la formación académica, alguna materia o algún curso para mejorar y promover el uso de la bicicleta.
I think that can be a really good way to do it, and we see examples of schools in the UK and elsewhere who have, National Cycle to School Week, and things like that can be a really good way to encourage people who don't cycle or walk to school at the moment to do it. And it can be part of other lessons as well. So, we see schools actually saying, well, why do we want children to cycle to school? And that can be good around bringing in issues to do with health, to do with the environment, to do with transport decarbonisation. So there are some really good school programs that actually exist that help children, to cycle to school, and crucially stop them from being driven to school. And for many children, once they start cycling to school, they don't want to stop. They enjoy it. And whether it's cycling or whether it's being on a scooter, it gives them more independence. It gives them more fun. And I think, having these schemes to sort of try something for a week can be really good to actually, get people to try something different, and then they find out that they really like them. So schools programs can be great for that.
Muchas gracias, Susan. ¿Alguna persona tiene una pregunta adicional que quiera enviarla por el chat o que tal vez quiera abrir el micrófono?
Yo sí, buenos días. Es más como el tema de lo que preguntaba ahora por lo de los ciclistas urbanos, porque pues no sé si de pronto hayan trabajado de pronto acá, de pronto en otros países acá más de Sudamérica. Pues yo soy acá de Cali, trabajo en la Secretaría de Movilidad, y digamos que el mayor reto es darle el espacio al ciclista. Pero acá en su mayoría son ciclistas urbanos, ¿sí? Está el ciclista de recreación, pues que tiene sus espacios, pero el ciclista urbano es el que más, pues, aunque hay mucho motociclista, bastante, pero también hay ciclistas. Y también como tratar de incentivar, pues también porque pues, no llevan, digamos, ciertas cosas que pues deben ayudarlo a darle más seguridad, como las luces y los respectivos. A eso era que pues de pronto no sé si había estrategias como también para poder incentivarlos.
Creo que te perdimos, Diego, al final.
So, sorry, was the question how to encourage more urban cycling? What are the incentives?
Al menos yo no escuché el final de la pregunta, no sé, Diego, si nos puedas...
Perdón, él preguntó sobre qué estrategias específicamente se pueden implementar para trabajar con los ciclistas urbanos desde esa perspectiva que ellos, digamos, respeten las normas, usen los implementos. Entonces, creo que Susan ya respondió en parte esa pregunta, pero seguramente Diego quiere que ahondemos en qué estrategias específicas.
Sorry, is this to do with encouraging cycling or addressing the behaviors that were mentioned earlier?
La segunda, abordar los comportamientos.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think mostly it's to do with enforcement, and we see that the police will have crackdowns on cyclists, for example, going through red lights or cycling on the footway where they shouldn't be, because that's for people walking. So typically it's done through police enforcement, but we also have the various sort of cycle lobby groups or cycle support groups who will, emphasize the importance of, obeying the laws and why, and finding out why people, are people not obeying the red lights because they're in a rush or because they think they don't need to. So I said it's normally a mixture of police enforcement, and I said also through existing cycling groups, but certainly the experience is when cycling becomes more diverse, that behavior generally improves.
Gracias, Susan. Rubén ha levantado la mano.
Sí, gracias, Edna. Thank you, Susan. Una pregunta. Resulta que en Colombia hay leyes en las cuales hay incentivos para las personas que utilicen la bicicleta como modo de transporte para ir a laborar. Pero las empresas no tienen adecuado, digamos, estacionamientos ciclísticos, ni mucho menos hacen que sus empleados tengan el beneficio de la normatividad que dice. ¿Cómo hacer para involucrar a las empresas en todo este trámite? Teniendo en cuenta que muchas hacen caso omiso de las normas y no hay una ley que las sancione. ¿Cómo hacer para que haya una coacción o un entendimiento para hacer que las empresas procuren estandarizar y cumplimiento de la ley?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think sometimes it will be to do with cycle parking, and what we've found is if the companies have areas for car parking, or any street space, you can fit 10 cycles or sometimes more in the space of one car parking space. So actually, by taking out a car parking space, you can put in a lot of cycle parking that might encourage people, or means they could, take part in that cycle to work scheme. I think the other thing is, and certainly the evidence from the UK is that if employees cycle to work, they tend to be fitter, they tend to be healthier, and they have fewer time off sick due to illness. And once you start talking to employers about the benefits of having their employees cycle, then they start to make different priorities, and maybe they manage to find some space within the building or within the car park where they can put in some cycle parking. So I said UK figures are that people who walk or cycle have 27% fewer days off sick than those who drive to work, because they're healthier and they're more active. If you talk to an employer and say, I could reduce your sickness bill of your staff by up to a quarter, then you tend to have a very different discussion about what can be provided, and suddenly people see it, the employers see it as a benefit to do this as opposed to a burden. So I think it's always really important to think about the outcomes of what might be achieved, rather than the business just seeing this as another thing they have to do and another burden. So that can be a useful way to frame the conversation.
Ok, muchas gracias, Susan. Teníamos dos preguntas específicas que quisiéramos conversar con ustedes. Creo que la primera ya la hemos abordado un poco con las conversaciones que hemos tenido en los últimos minutos, y respecto a cuáles han sido los mayores desafíos que han identificado al implementar alguna de las estrategias en proyectos de movilidad activa en su municipio. No sé si alguno de ustedes quiera ahondar un poco específicamente, no sé si en Jumbo han desarrollado últimamente un proyecto y hayan identificado ciertos desafíos mayores, o en Palmira o alguna de las personas que nos acompañan el día de hoy, si pudieran conversar con nosotros un poco sobre ello. Sabemos entonces que el tema de la seguridad, más que todo como el uso de estos implementos como cascos, reflectivos, es un problema como bien importante, porque es difícil promover el uso adecuado y constante de estos elementos que las personas creen que no son necesarios, que simplemente es por cumplir una normativa, pero en realidad, bueno, todos sabemos que aportan bastante a la seguridad de las personas, pero es uno de los problemas más grandes que tenemos en el momento de salir en una bicicleta y poder portar todos los elementos de seguridad. Creo que ese sería uno de esos que ya hemos conversado. No sé si alguno de ustedes identifica otro.
Bueno, yo quiero compartir desde mi punto de vista como actor político. Primero que todo, los desafíos más importantes que tenemos nosotros es la actualidad política. Es que se me olvidó la palabra. Bueno, la concesión que tienen los políticos de hacer eso. Si no hay la voluntad política, porque muchas veces no hay voluntad para hacer las cosas hacia el recurso. O si hay, si hay voluntad, no hay recursos, pero más que todo la voluntad política y la conveniencia de los actores políticos es uno de los principales problemas que tenemos. Es un desafío que tenemos que empezar a implementar. Segundo, la estrechez de las vías que hay en cada municipio de nosotros, que de pronto no sea para cultivar este espacio, pero estamos tratando de hacer gracias al acompañamiento de dar estrategias que podamos resolver este principio. Y segundo, es la cultura, la escasa cultura que tiene latinoamericana en la utilización de ciclovía y el respeto hacia los demás. Esos serían los desafíos que tenemos que empezar a trabajar desde ya, la cultura, la cosa política y tratar de ser una ciudad inteligente y proyectarla no solamente a los vehículos, sino también a la movilidad con bicicletas. Esos son los desafíos que tenemos que enfrentar casi todos los latinoamericanos.
Muchas gracias, Rubén. Sí, de acuerdo. Y más este primer punto de voluntad política creo que alarga bastante los procesos, siendo que los temas de planificación y más que todo de construcción e implementación de cicloinfraestructuras toma bastante tiempo. Mantener la continuidad con los diferentes periodos políticos es uno de los grandes desafíos. En el chat, Susan, nos preguntan cómo es el proceso de socialización con la comunidad de estos proyectos de cicloinfraestructura, si es que de pronto hay algunas personas que se puedan oponer a ciertos proyectos de cicloinfraestructura, ¿cómo se resuelven estos problemas?
Would you like me to comment on that? Yeah. The political will, I mean, certainly what's helped in the UK is having ambassadors or champions for walking and cycling at local councils or in the municipalities. So to actually have somebody whose role is to champion walking and cycling across the whole business and ideally have a political champion as well. So, you know, someone who every time can challenge and say, what about walking and what about cycling? So I think that can really help in terms of the politics of it all. I think it's also the fact that if politicians can improve cycling and walking, it's one of the few transport things that they can do during their political lifetime and gain a lot of support for doing it. Most schemes in transport take quite a long time, but actually if you can improve walking and cycling, you'll be helping all the people who vote for you. And I said you'll be doing it within your political term. So that can be a really good vote winner for politicians. I think in terms of the socializing the infrastructure point, again, if you have trial schemes like sort of, you know, closing streets off for a day and different people start using them, particularly children start using them for playing in, for cycling in, for walking, it can help people get used to a different type of infrastructure and people can see the changes. So it can be really important to have these trial temporary schemes as a way of letting people see how streets can be used differently and how people can use them. So that's been really important in the UK and elsewhere, having sort of car-free days just to see what the impact can be.
Muchas gracias, Susan.
Y Susan, perdón, y sobre la pregunta de cómo manejan las socializaciones de los proyectos de cicloinfraestructura, cómo los abordan. Es decir, cómo comunicarle a la comunidad estos proyectos, a pesar de que va a haber siempre retractores, personas o grupos de interés que se opongan al tipo de proyectos.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, as I said before, sometimes it's talking about the outcomes that you will achieve through these projects. So it's talking about making safer streets, having better places for children, having better air quality. So I said all of these good outcomes. So it moves the conversation from just being about putting in some cycling. But I said having these trials, these temporary schemes, that's a really good way of involving lots of people in the discussion. So if you have a car-free weekend, for example, you see different people come out and use the streets and get involved and show their support. And those people probably wouldn't have done that if there hadn't been that trial. And I said that's where, you know, if you have a consultation and say cycling consultation, you won't get that many people that respond to it, because if they're people who don't currently cycle, they're not going to respond to something called cycling consultation. But if you have it as a broader, I said either to do with transport or to do with, you know, safer streets, then you're more likely to get people to participate and get more people across the community to be involved, to help with that socialization. So I think it's the language that's used, it's focusing on the outcomes, but also it's having these trial days, these trial schemes to try and involve more people, so that, you know, what we find is it's about showing the support of the majority, and often it's only the minority that are against, but it's the minority that have the loudest voices. So it's involving more people in the discussion.
¿Y hay establecidos procesos de consulta para este tipo de proyectos? ¿Son mandatorios?
What we're seeing, I mean, there are different sort of packages for consultation. There's one used a lot called Commonplace. I don't know whether there's an equivalent where you are, but it's a map-based, and it enables people to drop a pin on a place that they think needs improving. Could be their own street, could be their journey to the shops, it could be for cycling or for walking. So it relies on people having mobile phones. So that doesn't work for everybody, but works for a lot more, you know, more people than, you know, having to go to a council office with a plan. And then people can say what they think that needs changing. The decision makers can see, you know, if there's lots of people pointing to one particular junction or area or intersection, then that needs doing, and then you can let people know about the changes. So there are good online techniques for involving more people. Having Zoom meetings like this again can be a good way for more people to participate, because they're not having to travel to a location to see plans. So there are different ways of doing it in terms of involving more people. So I think we are seeing some improvements in this area. It's not great because it does rely on people having internet access, people having mobile phones. So it doesn't reach everybody, but it reaches more people than the previous methods of consultation.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Creo que no tenemos más preguntas por el momento. Les agradecemos a todas las personas que participaron, tanto por el chat como por el micrófono. And well, thank you very much, Susan, for your time and for being with us in this first part of the session. Now, we are going to start the second part with Despacio. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing this information with us.
Thank you very much. It was my
Susan,
pleasure.
Do you have any final remarks?
I will try, and if it would be good to see the chat if possible, because I couldn't understand the chat, I'm afraid. But it was great to hear the comments of people, and I think it is just trying to make sure that as many people as possible can cycle, because the benefits in terms of health, in terms of air quality, in terms of climate, in terms of social equity are really, really huge. And once you start to see more people cycling, it just spreads and more people want to. So really welcome the fact that you're having this discussion today, and hope that it will lead to more inclusive cycling in the future. So thank you very much.
Okay, Susan, we will make sure we will translate those comments, and so that you can, just take them with you. I think you responded to most of them. The last one is about that one of the greatest the challenges that these municipalities are facing, from Juan David Giraldo, is that the lack of, exclusive and segregated alleys for cyclists. So, and we know, the lack of infrastructure that is exclusive for cyclists, of course, it's a lack in many areas of the world, but it's a big challenge for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's about priorities, and I think it's changing priorities to give, priority to people walking, wheeling, and cycling.
Perfect. Okay, Susan. Well, once again, thanks you very much for connecting from London. We really appreciate, and just I guess if we could applaud you. Thanks so much for your presentation. Thanks for all your thoughts on everything.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.